the amount of process and everything that it takes to move off of it. Like in the private sector, that might just be a new VP of engineering who's super gung-ho about a cloud platform and is like, we're going to AWS this thing now. But for the government, like, it's very far from what that process looks like. And I think, these platforms are super sticky, and like moving off of them is almost impossible, even if it's not a regulatory or legal kind of like holding to a contract or something like that. I think that in of itself is a pretty big problem, even outside of the capabilities of MilCloud in of itself.
Welcome back to It's Fine, a podcast by Hunter Strategy, where we explore the quirks and quagmires of working for the federal government. Today, we're cracking open the case of the Department of Defense's digital dilemmas, where even new technology can be crippled by dozens of running antivirus agents, hundreds of CAC-PIN prompts, and the glory that is NIPRNet. Specifically, we'll be talking about how these limitations affect the DoD DevSecOps transformational challenge. Today, we're joined by two incredibly brilliant and frankly incredibly patient engineers, Michael Christopherson and Matt DeVertola, senior DevOps engineers at Hunter Strategy. They'll share their firsthand experiences navigating a computer environment where cutting edge can sometimes mean some scratches and where deploying new software feels a lot like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops. We'll discuss everything from snail-paced logins, how the movie Inception is a lot like the number of jump boxes required in DoD's zero trust environment, and the titanic task of actually using DoD's IT infrastructure in an attempt to migrate from legacy software to a modern cloud native approach. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
So the first question, just to kick us off, and either of you, whichever one of you, I guess, has the story that they'd want to run with here a little faster, can you share an experience where either outdated computer systems or a specific aspect of something that you would really only find in the DoD operating environment has impacted your ability to implement modern best DevSecOps practices?
Definitely a few immediately come to mind. I think one of the things that I feel like is one of the most difficult things for us is network speed across NIPR and SIPR as a whole. And the movement of, 500 megabytes taking an hour or longer is a bit insane. That's something that I think we deal with a little bit too much. And the fact that, database backups need to be collected manually in of itself is a little bit insane, but that could be a bit of our architecture specifically. But yeah, those are some of the immediate ones.
Let's dig into that one for just a second on database backups, because for a very long time, that was standard, right? I mean, everyone had to do database backups in some way, be it manual or with an automated running local task. But would you say that that need is an artifact of a DoD policy, or more of an artifact of you can't use cloud on that project where that's just 2 button clicks, or we aren't yet using cloud, maybe, whatever the case may be?
Yeah, I mean, I would go, maybe it's a little bit more of the politics behind the CSP selection for that project, but absolutely related to the cloud provider, which, I'm aware a lot of the DoD still uses. Don't know if it's cool to call that out specifically by name, but
if you're talking about MilCloud, I think that's a fair game, because, well, look, it's not a hyperscale cloud in the commercial sense, right? And everybody knows it. There are certainly some, and MilCloud is now being rebranded as Stratus, where I feel like they are trying to provide newer services like container-based deployments and other things within that environment. So they're trying to come to speed. But at the same time, and sorry, even before that, I also understand that there are some laws and regulations that prevent some applications, none that I think we work on, but some applications just have to be in a DoD data center where the physical security controlled is a guy with a gun that has a U.S. military rank. And that's just the law for that system. Again, I don't think that's the case for anything we're working on today, but I understand the need for creating an on-prem cloud because of some of those regulations. But and I think that that's probably also worth just talking about a little bit is, so you have to use MilCloud, not in our case, but somebody else has to. There's no way to get to Amazon or Microsoft because regulations prevent that. That's going to be expensive on many levels, right? Every compute unit and storage unit of MilCloud is drastically more expensive than commercial equivalents, even commercial equivalents in GovCloud, which is more expensive than a commercial cloud equivalents already. I guess there's a lot of technology gaps there, right? Like, isn't that somebody kind of pretending that the government thinks that they're better at doing this than Amazon, right? Isn't that kind of like an implied, concept by that? If it's being advertised as only use this for regulated workloads because you have to, I think that's fair advertising, right? I have no qualms about that. But if it's like, no, this is just a viable alternative, I don't know. Is it?
I don't think so at all. Kind of to bounce off Divertola's point of like our database backups, I came from the, I joined Hunter, roughly 2 years ago now, and came from the public sector where the big thing that has stood out to me since I joined is, disk was cheap, right? It was always, oh yeah, we can throw an extra 100 gigs at this server or throw, anything else at this server. And, it's in MilCloud, it seems like at times it's practically pulling teeth, filling out, all of the forms just to get an extra 5 gigs of space on a server so you can, turn a log up to verbose logging to troubleshoot an issue. Because everything's ran on such razor thin margins that, for the rest of the world, the rest of, the DevSecOps community, relatively speaking, disk is cheap. That's the cheap thing. You can have plenty of space to, throw on servers or containers and move files around and backups around, or, just automate your processes. And that has not been the experience, working in MilCloud, because they have such, vastly more limited resources to divvy out to everybody. So they have to be more careful with it.
I even piggybacking on that a little bit too, like, I think a lot of it is a process problem too. Like MC mentioned, it's pulling teeth if you need an extra 40 gigs added to a Linux box somewhere. But like, imagine the amount of process that they need to go through for kind of the bigger picture here of deploying something out to MilCloud, or even what transition it would take, even if you're not required, like you were saying, Matt, by law and regulation and stuff, to be on MilCloud, the amount of process and everything that it takes to move off of it. Like in the private sector, that might just be a new VP of engineering who's super gung-ho about a cloud platform and is like, we're going to AWS this thing now. But for the government, like, it's very far from what that process looks like. And I think, these platforms are super sticky, and like moving off of them is almost impossible, even if it's not a regulatory or legal kind of like holding to a contract or something like that. That I think that in of itself is a pretty big problem, even outside of the capabilities of MilCloud in of itself.
So I want to pick on that. You made a really good comment about stickiness of platforms, right? And I think that is something worth exploring in the context of the department, because I think a lot of people that are still on MilCloud are there because of its stickiness. I think the number of workloads that have a regulatory requirement to be on-prem are percentage-wise, I don't know the actual number, but percentage-wise feels like it'd be small, certainly less than half. If I had to pick a number, a percentage, it's probably in like the 10 to 25% range. Again, I'm making that up. Nobody quote me on that, but it's on the very smaller amount in the few regulations that I am aware of. And most of those are national security related. They're highly classified. And when I say highly classified, I mean usually above the secret level, or with secret with certain compartmentalization or releasability requirements. So if you're able to get to a new platform, there's a lot of talk how, well, you got to move to Kubernetes and containers. That's the commercial approach to mitigating just how because even for commercial people, stickiness of platforms and vendor lock in your cloud selection is a real problem, right? Yep. And everyone that says, oh, just Kubernetes it, that'll fix it, I'm okay. I mean, like, it's better than it's better than it being all VMs. So I'll agree that it's a nod in the right direction. but does DoD policy and culture let you, assuming you can get to that DoD approved cloud environment, assuming you have that political buy-in to do that, and you get through all of those challenges we just talked to, are we allowed to deploy an architecture that we can move from AWS to Azure or vice versa? Or does we just end up in another kind of 100% vendor lock situation once we move? How has policy and the nuance of it kind of, or policy and politics really, kind of shaped how those migrations happen and how the technology is allowed to be used?
Well, I think actual implementation of it is questionable. Like, I think Party Bus is kind of a cool example of this, to where you can kind of abstract away like a decent bit of that vendor lock-in. And, to my understanding of Party Buses, Air Force has a giant, effectively like commoditized like VMs across a bunch of different cloud providers. And then they enable, public sector orgs to deploy containerized workloads onto them. I think that feels like the right solution, but I don't know if it was actually kind of implemented as well, or if it's even like technically possible to do that at scale for most places. But to me, that feels like the right kind of move there.
Yeah, because I think you very much can still get locked into one cloud provider otherwise, right? Because for better, for worse, everybody still likes to, have a lot of control over their own little fiefdom, right? And they want to be able to make sure that, it's something they understand, something that they work with. So, if a particular organization says, hey, we're moving to Azure, and, because you can't discount the people problem as well of, the people that you have implementing all of these things have to know how to work within that tool set. So migrating to, let's say, Azure or AWS, your people have to know how to do that, know how to implement those tools. And a lot of times, people spend the vast majority of their time working in one cloud provider. So that's where they get comfortable with, and that's where they migrate stuff. So deploying the actual application onto Kubernetes, yes, it's a fantastic step. And it makes, working within the application, or, hopefully you're running local environments for your developers as well. It makes a lot of those problems not as big of problems, right? You're able to, troubleshoot problems more quickly, have devs encounter issues sooner. But once you actually get to shipping those things up into, lower level development environment, Nipper or a higher classified environment, you can run into some issues there. Even on some of the projects we've been running, I've found it a joy that, even particular APIs, let's say for one cloud provider, there's, a Terraform provider that works in the public cloud, but then in the Gov cloud, you have to make a handful of configuration changes that are, thankfully those ones are fairly well documented out there in the internet. But then as soon as you go to, let's say, implementing something at the SIPR level or higher, cat's out of the bag. Who knows what you're actually going to have to change? Those changes aren't well documented, especially even, hitting particular endpoints where there might be a specific endpoint that is publicly available and you know what it is for, let's say, GovCloud. It's not even documented anywhere, and you have to figure that out on your own for the higher level environments to use, Azure or AWS or Google. And I think a large part of the problem in the issue there is there's no good place for that to be documented across organizations, across companies, right? I think there's a lot of engineers spending time reinventing wheels that other engineers, spent a lot of time figuring out. And they could write a really handy, article on how to solve those problems. But then you run into the issues of, okay, what part of this is classified, so I can't put it out on the public internet? There's no really good tool for knowledge sharing of these type of things within the DoD, or even across different organizations that work within the classified world. There's no good knowledge sharing for, hey, these are the massive differences that you have to account for, and hey, we spent some time figuring that out. It's a lot of, hey, you got to kind of figure it out on your own.
So it's an interesting point, because I feel like some companies try really hard to have meetups and have community discussions, and what can be said there or not, to your point, that can get interesting.
Yep.
But I also feel like there's a lot of people, especially those that kind of grew up in the early Cloud One, Platform One days on the government side, that have spun off their own companies. Some of them are really great at sharing what they do. I'll give a shout out to Defense Unicorns and Zarf. That the whole idea of how to do CI/CD through an air gap and having a nice kind of well understood framework around that. That's a great. It doesn't solve the exact problem that you referred to, MC, but like,
Yep.
what a great thing that it'd be wonderful if everyone's standardized around. And I'm really happy that there are people like that in the community that do share. But then there's other people that are just kind of like, well, why would I share that? That's my competitive advantage against people that haven't had to go through this before. Which I'm sympathetic to, right? As a business owner, I'm sympathetic to doing that, not because I don't want other people to be successful and I don't want to share, because generally there's enough work to go around that being exclusionary isn't helpful. But what I do run into a lot on some programs that I support is people that get hired and we're a subcontractor in those cases. And the prime's like, this person has 15 years cloud experience. And first thought I have is probably not, because the cloud really hasn't been a thing for 15 years unless they were using the simple queue service from AWS in the early days, which I was. There weren't that many people doing it for DoD back then. That wasn't the thing. And second, they have just huge knowledge gaps when it comes to understanding the cloud access point connectivity. The networking is incredibly strongly prescribed to do cloud in a defense environment, and it's very well documented as to how to do it from a pure network architecture perspective, but how to turn that into express route configurations and VPC, like how that actually translates into the CSP tooling, is still very much proprietary and not very well shared. And I think that if while I would love to see it shared, and we even struggle to share it internally as a company among other engineers sometimes. We've gotten better, but it's always a journey to continue sharing. But if it were to be shared in a big repository where someone can print out a cert that says, hey, I'm DoD AWS CAP certified, there's a pretty good chance that at the end of that printout, they're still not going to know how to do it if they haven't done it before. Mm-hmm. And that really is kind of a burden to customers, right? That want to put out an RFP saying, I don't want someone to learn how the CAP works while I'm paying them. I want someone that's done this before. And so it's an interesting kind of balance there, because you want to share and you want to do well. And BD people are going to do what they always do, which is pretend that they already know things that they don't know, and that ends up costing the taxpayer frequently. So it is kind of an interesting dichotomy there, because I'm all for sharing. I hate when sharing allows people to misrepresent their knowledge to the detriment of competitors like us that have the knowledge. We're not the only ones. There's plenty like us out there. Yep. Or just to the taxpayer that ends up paying that company to teach people to do things, when the RFP clearly stated, you need to do this you need to already know how to do this in order to work here. So that's always a bit of a back and forth. So one question, just to move on to culture and bureaucratic hurdles, which we talked about a little bit. I know we mentioned, the move to Kubernetes is a way to reduce some friction in cloud lock-in. It's not 100%, but it does reduce it. Do you get pushback on being told to use, on saying, hey, I'm going to use Kubernetes in the cloud? That's part of my architecture. Is that a thing that, even though it's a IL4, IL5, IL6 service that has been well tested and is used in production all over, are you guys allowed to use it when you say you want to?
So yes, we absolutely have been able to use it. We're implementing it now on some projects, and it's been fantastic. But it's been a very large hurdle to overcome. And I would say it's more so because in my experience so far, the DoD is so good at people get comfortable with what they know, and it's easy to stay working on what you know and not adopt new technologies. Obviously you're updating, so you're staying on the latest version of what you know, but it's easy to get in a role of just working on the same thing. So going into a group of people in an organization and, getting them to learn the new technologies and say, hey, this is actually, it's going to be, it's going to be a crappy next 6 months while we learn this, but we're going to come out the other end and everybody's going to be happier. Kind of framing it that way has helped. And I think a lot of people are liking the changes of migrating to Kubernetes, simply from the fact that, on the projects that me and Matt work on specifically, I know we have ran into a lot of the, it worked on my machine problems, right? It worked locally. Here we're going to throw it over the fence and hopefully you guys can deploy it and make it work securely on the servers. And we, run into constant issues with that. And I think that is one of the massive benefits of Kubernetes and just containerization in general, is when you get people to, have their local development environment basically be the exact same type of setup that it's going to be running in your higher level development and then, Nipper or Sipper environments. And this isn't even DoD specific. It was the exact same case in my public sector work, where just that, hey, we created this thing, it works on my machine, let's throw it over the fence. That move to containerization is massively helpful. So has it been hard from the adoption standpoint? Yes, but from the management level people and, the civilian employees who oversee our projects, they've been, completely in support of it, just as long as we go about it the right way.
So one thing I've noticed, and this is not a DoD specific thing, but some people might lean too far into Kubernetes, right? It's the automatic choice for containers and I'm more of an AWS guy than an Azure guy, but ECS is fine for some use cases. You don't always need Kubernetes. Have you guys, and this is more of a nuanced question for how does that apply to DoD, have you found either we have to do Kubernetes, it's the buzzword DoD thing, or has it been do you really need Kubernetes? That seems really hard for us to support. Or in the other is I know how containers work. I cannot spell Kubernetes. Please use the pure container approach, right? Because I feel like I'm sure in different places, all of those are happening, right? But I'm curious what you guys have experienced.
So in our specific situation too, I think a big part, and I don't know if this is, just us or if this is a common pattern other places, but we don't own our ATO, which means, we don't really own that actual environment itself. So there is always a party that we kind of need to touch base with and make sure that they're okay with running this. So and kind of to MC's point a little bit earlier, a lot of, we're very used to the VM thing and that's kind of what we know. We don't know the whole Kubernetes thing. So we did get a lot of pushback there. And I think, it speaks a little bit more to how difficult it can be to get an ATO and some of the rippling effects that has across development. But I think for us, that was one of the big parts is, we don't have the final say in this. Ultimately, it's the organization that owns that ATO.
And actually think that's a unique concept we should just talk about for a second. These DoD hosting providers, and I'm using air quotes because they don't actually host anything themselves. They don't have a data center. They don't have racks. They're not a reseller. They, in the case of the organization you're referring to, and I think this is common among OSD organizations in general, just because of how top heavy and close to senior leadership in the Pentagon this is. Whereas when you get out to the services, I feel like they have them too, but they're at the service level, so they're a little closer to the mission, right? So they have a little bit more mission orientation. You have these effectively middle people that are responsible for the boundary, right? But not necessarily what's inside of the boundary. How does that change how you would do a migration, right? How would you, in the case of take out Mill Cloud, some on-prem, corporate cloud, right? That you need to move towards a true hyperscale cloud. But let's say your company, right, you're a financial services firm, and that financial services firm has decided these are your data center operations people, and you got to go through them. And now that we're using cloud, you're still going through them. You're just going through them for cloud instead of for the data center that they used to manage. What does that do in terms of applying best practices, timelines? What does that add in terms of your day-to-day responsibilities? Like, what's different about that than what you've experienced before?
I was gonna, immediately say less autonomy and a little bit less flexibility with tooling and things like that. So, and this might, again, a little bit more specific to our case, but like even using Terraform in our case was a bit of like a newer kind of concept and a little bit of like a conversation that needed to be had because there wasn't a lot of experience with IAC. But doing that in any sort of commercial environment wouldn't be like, I don't think nearly as contested or even like thought about. It would kind of be the no-brainer, like this is the best practice that everyone does. It's the AWS recommendation to do, or it's the GCP recommendation or whatever it might be. But I don't think that there is as much of a culture of like adherence to like cloud provider best practices that like I've seen in commercial spaces in what we were dealing with, at least in this specific kind of client.
Yeah, because I can think of one specific example, where we are using IAC, we're using Terraform to deploy an environment for one of our projects for our subscription within this greater ATO, right? And that has caused some issues or some conflict because we are still, at the mercy of the people who own the ATO, who own our, environment holistically, where, since they're needing to make changes to different things that live within our environment, they've gone in and just made those changes via the UI of the cloud portal. And then we go to run Terraform, to apply our next set of changes that we need to make. And boom, all of the things that they had gone in and manually changed are now back to what we considered the golden state of life because, that communication wasn't fully happening there. Or, they had just gone in and made those changes, not realizing that, hey, this is the way that Terraform works. This is the way that infrastructure as code tooling works. You can't just go make manual changes and things anymore. You can, but it either needs to be a one-off test that you then import into your automation tooling, or you're going to have a bad time when I run my Terraform again to make it what we're considering the golden state. And so that's been a fun challenge that we have now started to work through, and we've laughed about a little bit with the people that we're working with, because they very much have come just from that historical way of doing things within the DoD. They absolutely want to learn and start doing it the new way, but it's just there's so many things that come into play, whether you have your timelines that you're trying to meet, so you might not necessarily be able to meet a new tooling. Because one thing that I have vastly learned is doing things in an infrastructure as code manner doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to do it faster, right? People always think, oh yeah, you're going to use IAC, you're going to go so much faster being able to do this. In some respects, yes, you can move a little bit faster, but it's more so it's a self-documenting way to create your environment that you can then duplicate that for further environments. But the first time you're creating an environment, it might actually take you a little bit longer to create it, doing it in infrastructure as code route. But in the long term, it's the vastly better way to do it, right? Because you don't have to worry about, if Michael's, outside and gets hit by a bus and Michael built most of the environment, well, crap, Michael's gone now. Well, without, something like IAC, all of that knowledge is lost, right? But at least with something like infrastructure as code, it's at least self-documented there where it's like, okay, Michael's gone, but at least we have what he built and we have it here to look at.
I prefer to think of winning the lottery than getting hit by the bus, but sure. Just what, and one thing, just in kind of in a closing thought, if you guys had to think of, and I have one to start off with, if you guys want a second to think about it, what would you recommend to the department to make things easier, to make things closer to a commercial state. And the commercial state's not the right word, because the commercial state, you can see all the hacks that are going on. That's actually not where we want to be going, but towards a best practice state, right? And I can say mine to give you guys a second to think. For me, I think it's really, it comes back to acquisition, in making sure that the people that are at these hosting providers, that are at these ATO events, I can't tell you how many of those people are there because they know the DoD ATO process well, but not because they understand the underlying technology that they are assessing, or that they are approving, or that they are even configuring sometimes in the case of the hosting providers. And while the pool of people that have done what we've done, meaning know how these tools work, know how the government works, and made them work together, is a small pool. And selfishly, I would like all of the business towards people that need that. But I think that starting to emphasize stronger workforce training requirements for people in those roles at the acquisition level, where you shouldn't necessarily be an AWS DevOps engineer if you don't have a certain amount of experience doing it in this environment, or a certification or whatever. And again, the government can sometimes go overboard, and I deal with certain things with impossible labor categories to fit. So I certainly don't recommend that. But I do think that today, the idea of a sysadmin for cloud and a sysadmin for Milk Cloud, or for AWS versus Milk Cloud, is not really distinguished at the acquisition level. And I think that when that trickles down, that creates a lot of problems for you guys. And so I think that starting at the acquisition part, to be really specific as to what is needed and what the performance standards of a person in that place are, because if you go by performance standards versus labor category compliance, I have any number of people, some of which are on your teams, that are fresh out of school, very little experience, and can run circles around some of the people that have been doing this for 10 years. So it's not about how many years have you been doing it and have you done it specifically at the DoD before, but it's how do you perform your problem solving? How well do you understand these underlying concepts? How quickly, how we can get acquisition to look at performance standards versus, job description requirements, and how we can get people to recognize that just because you can do it in Mill Cloud, and that's technically got the word cloud in it, does not mean you know anything about commercial cloud. And then just because you've done it in commercial cloud doesn't mean you know anything about when you start getting into Gov Cloud and those differences. And then even further, because you mentioned as you get into the high side clouds, I had the privilege of testing Azure Top Secret when it was still in preview. And I got a copy of the SDK for PowerShell to just try some things. And it was timing out every single call. And then I look at it, and it's because the endpoints are all .us, which is the Azure Gov Cloud unclass endpoint. And again, I had never used it before, but because I had familiarity and I recognized, I know what .us is for, I was able to go in and change it all to .ic.gov, because that's what JWix does for endpoints. And then, the endpoints were there and they mostly worked. They just didn't update the SDK. And so, again, you can't have expected me to know it before it was in preview. It literally didn't exist before that. But there's a performance standard of proficiency in cloud, proficiency in Gov Cloud, and troubleshooting capabilities to be able to tie those things together that it feels like a good contracts officer should be able to figure out. So that's my soapbox, but I think it's get back to acquisition and have us get the right people in the right places. That would be what I would tell DoD, but I'd love to hear what you guys would say.
What was the original question again?
What advice would you give DoD? Well, at the end of this, with these challenges and your desire to see less of these challenges as you grow in your DoD experience, what would you tell them to change? I'm telling them change acquisition, get better people, and measure them better. I said it way longer than that. That was actually a way more succinct way of saying it. But
so I think that having a process for explaining to people who aren't new to working in cloud, but who, potentially want to make the jump from, working in the private sector to coming over and working for the public sector in a cleared environment, some type of process for saying, hey, this is what a STIG is, right? You're not just because well, in the private sector, it's okay, let's follow best practices. Maybe depending on what you're doing, you might have to follow HIPAA or PCI compliance, things like that. But beyond that, it's a lot of what is the company's accepted risk level. So having that process of being like, okay, hey, this is what a STIG is. This is how you follow them. This is how you can potentially know what you need to do. And these are some of the common differences between working for public clouds and the private clouds, right? Having some type of, and everybody always talks about more training, but having some type of publicly available knowledge base, or even just specific to the DoD training that is, hey, you were a rock star working for the public cloud. Here's the 10 or 15 things that every person who makes the transition to working for the government always runs into as their issues right off the bat. Because that has been, a lot of my experiences. I felt very confident in the ways I did for all the things for the public sector, but now coming over to the DoD, working as a contractor, it's been, a very big learning curve of, okay, what's the legally required way to do this now? Not just, oh, hey, this is the company's suggested best practice, but this is legally what I have to do now to meet those compliance standards.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a lot of the resources that I would think that I kind of already exist for that are behind a CAC wall. So you can't really share them. And so there's got to be a way to maybe not all of them. I don't know why they are. Sometimes things are behind a CAC wall because of, I don't know, inertia, right? Like they're not even FOU or not even CUI. They're just there. So I think somebody kind of taking the time to figure that out. And if there's some things that legitimately are CUI, is there a way? I mean, I do this in the intelligence side all the time where something is, TSSCI with a whole bunch of letters I'm not even allowed to say at the other end. But then I write a note in to say, hey, agency that made this highly classified, I would like to share this, either in an unclassified manner or in a secret manner or in a TS with a lot less of the letters on the other end manner. And I think if I say it this way, I'm not going to get to all the other stuff you don't want me to say. And there's a process for that, right? I mean, they have that in the intelligence world because it's very common where everybody keeps everything kind of wrapped up because that's just the way we're used to doing it. But when it's intelligence and it's like, hey, I want to go tell the SOC analyst down on the floor that has no clearance, I need to tell them something. I can't necessarily say why we know it or how we know it or all those things. Those are probably above the pay grade. But these 5 IP addresses, let's make sure we don't see any activity from there. Is usually and again, when it comes to cyber threat intelligence and things like that between NSA and CISA and Cybercom and DISA, like they actually have a pretty good chain of that to disseminate real threats, but not really on the education side. So I really do think that that's an interesting gap. It's like it's not that we as a government lack the process or knowledge or know that we need to do that. We do it for threat intelligence all the time, but we don't do it for our blue team things like STIGs. And I'd love to see if there's a way that we could do that better. That is a really good point. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that a combination of figuring out how to fix ATOs, I think that they are extraordinarily difficult to get. And I think it creates a ton of inefficiencies in like doing things well. And I think that's a big one. And I think another one is honestly, and this is probably something that's not just unique to like the DoD, but like it's okay for systems to be legacy, and like modernizing something just for the sake of modernizing it isn't necessarily always the best move. And if like the goal, and some parts of the DoD does do this well, others like have not. But if there's an old system that is not working well, oftentimes it's worth putting out an RFI or doing a new vehicle in of itself to rebuild from the ground up or think about it from the ground up rather than just trying to polish the legacy system that exists today and try to, jam it into this new kind of modality or format. So I think that's another big thing too, just because there is so much big legacy stuff across the government that it might just make more sense to rethink entirely versus trying to modernize.
I had an old CTO who came from Sun Microsystems. His name was John Krupe. Shout out to John if you ever watch this. Who used to ask people, what is the definition of a legacy system? And people would come up with all kinds of, the tech is old, it's not working so well. They have the definitions were just all over the place. And he would say, you're all wrong. The legacy system is the system that is today working. And it really does frame things a little differently when you think of it like that. Because then it's not that it takes a lot of the bad away. Legacy seems bad. Legacy seems like it's debt and it needs to be fixed. But definitionally, if it's legacy, if it's in the process, it's doing the thing, whatever the thing is. So I think we don't show enough respect for that. And a lot of dollars are spent trying to fix problems that aren't problems because of it. And then you've got, and I don't like to call out agencies here, but this one's really public. So you've got OPM still managing all of our background checks on a mainframe that's been compromised many times based on the number of letters and free credit monitoring reports I've gotten over the last 10 years. So it's a balance, right? Legacy isn't good because it's legacy, but it's also definitely not bad because it's legacy, and we do tend to think of it that way. Your fix ATO comment, I agree with, but I also don't want to open that can of worms if we're going to wrap this without doing a whole other hour podcast. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you all for joining me today. I really hope that this episode will be helpful for people that are just getting into the department and just understanding some of the problems, hopefully be a lifeline for people that are a little frustrated with understanding that this is normal, this is okay, and that there are a lot of really great people trying to make it better. And in some cases, there are reasons why it sucks. So we need to I don't think we ignore it or accept it, but we need to accept that those are also valid reasons, and we need to work within those reasons to make it better. And I think that's what you guys have really been exemplary about. So thank you both for your time, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.